Let's see, is this the first time?
That's
Is
a
this the
question
first
for
time?
John Ryan.
Okay, you went on once with John?
Yeah, I think they did a practice one.
Gotcha. Okay, so the practice one was practice for this?
Yes, yes.
I see. Okay, well,
A
now
lot
I'm
of
really
the,
honored.
a lot of the other groups are meeting via Zoom weekly.
Okay. Well, it is amazing that any of you are managing all these transitions because
Yes, it
you know,
is.
even my students are having trouble with them. And they're a lot more used to all this than we are. And
We're learning a lot.
I bet. And I almost asked John, well, you know, at some point or another, I could put you all in breakout rooms and you could do like little activities together. And if we weren't live streaming, I would say, yeah, we could do that, but that'll be for another time. I will be sharing my screen sometimes to show you texts that otherwise I bring you as handouts. So you should expect that every now and again, all of you will get a lot smaller. You might not see all the same people because I'll be sharing the screen and then everything will come and get a little bit smaller. And as I'm getting prepared to do that, I'm going to shut down everything else here that might possibly confuse me, just to make sure I've got what it is I need to get when we share. Okay. All right. Let's close that down too. Okay, wonderful. So I'm going to wait for John to give us the word on when we get started. And anybody, Lacey, hi, it's good to see you. I love how some of you are still dressed up for church. Lacey is definitely still dressed up for church, isn't she?
Can you hear me?
We can. If you can get a little closer, it'll be helpful. And I will, as I usually do, try to make sure that you yourselves are also participating in the program as we go. So I'll be asking some questions. What do we think about this? What do we think about that? There's no reason why we should all go into lecture mode and I talk the entire time. So, you know, be prepared to engage as we usually do. And we'll go forward that way.
I'm having trouble getting the audio on.
Hi,
We
Evelyn.
hear you. We can hear you.
Yeah, we do hear you, Evelyn. But your husband's probably going to need to get a little closer if he talks so that we can hear his voice. I think we're otherwise okay. All right. I think we're waiting on a few more people. Am I right?
Yes.
Yes, because we've had as many as 70. So I did, or not 70, what, like 50 to 60 in that class. And so, you know, I was thinking that'll be interesting if we all turn into Hollywood squares about this size.
Well, there's also the option for
Quick.
people, Barbara, there's also the option for people
Never had
to go to
trouble with the sound.
YouTube and watch.
Yes, my understanding
BCPC.
is that we are live on YouTube. So
Yeah.
all of us, you know, have to show our best colors and demonstrate what an incredibly intellectually, spiritually, and emotionally alive group we are to everybody out there. So, oh, looks like Tony's arrived and we can see the top of his head. Tony, we will want to see your whole face. So if you can move your camera a little bit so we can see the rest of you. Be good. There he is. Hey, Tony. It's good to see you.
Where?
Oh, that says mute me.
So the mute button is down in the left-hand corner or the upper right. If you hover over it, you'll see the mute and the unmute. I don't know if, I think I'm a co-host, so I can also mute you or unmute you.
Network.
And I don't know if you know this practice, but generally the best practice
Well, I think I'll
stay
start over.
muted.
How's that?
Unless you are
Can
speaking.
you? It's live.
Okay, so if you are not, I'm going to mute all of
Can I
us.
start over?
Okay,
Yes.
okay, yes, all right, yeah.
And make sure we're all muted.
Nope.
Okay. Let's
And
see
it
if
may
I-
be that John has left myself and Tony unmuted because I'm going to start
yeah.
and Tony's going to introduce you.
I think that's correct, Lynette, and that's why I didn't even try to mute either one of you, because I figured both of you got to be able to talk.
All right.
Tony,
I
don't
think,
take a long time with this.
I
Y'all
think
know
we're
me.
ready to start.
All right. Well, good morning. Welcome to the Davidson College
Wait a minute,
Presbyterian
Lynette.
Church Covenant class. Oh, you want me to start over?
Hold on 1 second.
Okay.
All right. Lynette, go ahead.
Good morning. Welcome to the Davidson College Presbyterian Church Covenant class. I'm Glenette Popovich, and I chair the Adult Ministries Committee. And we're delighted to bring this class to you virtually today. Who would have thought a month ago that we would be doing this? But thanks to a lot of hard work by our church staff, we're able to bring and share this class with you today. A couple of housekeeping things. If you're on Zoom in this class, if you wouldn't do something during class normally, you probably don't want to do it while you're Zooming. We'd like for you to stay in the view speaker. Will probably make it easier for you if you're on a PC in the upper right-hand corner. Rather than gallery, you can select view speaker, and that way whoever's talking will be a little bit larger. You probably want to stay on mute if you're not talking. And we'd like for you to use the chat feature in the bottom of the screen. John Ryan will be monitoring questions that you might have for Rabbi Barbara. If you're on YouTube, Robert Alexander will be monitoring and taking any questions that you might have for Rabbi Barbara in the comments section. And now I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Tony Abbott, who will introduce Rabbi Barbara.
You hear me? Am I unmuted?
You are Tony.
Okay. It's my great joy to introduce Barbara Tita, who has been teaching at DCTC now for, I'm trying to think, six years, Barbara?
I tried to figure it out last night. I think it's 6 or 7.
What I wanted to say is how much it means to us to have you as part of our teaching staff every year for the Covenant class. It's been a very exciting and powerful and meaningful experience for us, and we are grateful to you for that. Barbara has an MA and a PhD from the University of Missouri in Columbia, Missouri. She also has an MA from UNC Charlotte in the Department of Religious Studies. She has been at UNC Charlotte since 2006, and she teaches a variety of courses, including courses on the text of the Hebrew Bible, Jewish history, and the history of European anti-Semitism. She has put together a very special course for us. She was going to do something on her new book, and when the coronavirus erupted, she and John Ryan talked and decided it would be better to do something that was more relevant to the current issues. And so she decided to start with the Book of Lamentations and do a course on grief and sorrow and how we're dealing with that. And so, Barbara, I'm going to let you tell us a little bit about what you're going to do. So here is Barbara Tita.
Thank you, Tony. It's such a pleasure to be with you every year, something I look forward to every year. And working out with Tony and now John, what is the best thing we can bring to this class every year has been a joy and so productive. So we have 3 sessions before us, and we're going to use those 3 sessions. In the first session, we're going to look particularly at the figure of daughter Zion, who appears in the first 2 chapters of Lamentations. And in that particular set of chapters, we have a voice that is really unusual and really marked. by the kind of protest and resistance to what the deity, what God is doing, that is quite extraordinary for us to look at. So we're going to look at her text of resistance, and in the light of crisis and horror and lament. And next week, what we'll do is look at chapter 3, especially, in which the Gever, the strong man, goes through a cycle of emotional responses and spiritual responses that mirror, I think, often the kinds of responses we ourselves have to catastrophe and tragedy and mourning. And then in the final session, we'll take a look at a Jewish prayer, Moda'ani, or Moda'ani, depending on whether you are male or female. It's the first prayer that Jews say in the morning. And curiously, though it is a prayer of gratitude, it includes a reference to the text of Lamentations, the most sorrowful, the most anguished text that we have in the Hebrew Bible. And the question will be, why would a prayer of gratitude effectively create an echo of a text of sorrow and grief and even horror? So that's where we're going to go. And the first thing I want to do is ask you to take a look. I'm going to share my screen at some words that might seem, in the light of the word lament, applicable to you. Is there anybody who would like to read these words out loud? I can't see all of you, so you're going to have to give me an idea of who would like to read these words out loud. Somebody want to do that? Just volunteer and unmute and read them for us.
I can, Barbara. This is Alice.
Thank you, Allison. Please.
The words are mourn, grieve, bemoan, deplore, regret, bewail, cry, howl, wail, weep, sob, sorrow, rue.
All of these words come up as synonyms for the word lament. And now I'm just going to ask you to think, when you look at this, at the range of emotions that are presented here. Howl is a different word than sorrow. And yet the two are intimately linked. Bewail and cry might seem like very different words than regret, and yet these are linked. To deplore instead of grieve, and yet these words are linked. You're getting a full range of very intense emotions in the synonyms for the word lament. And just as these words indicate a wild range of emotional, even spiritual responses, so do the texts of lament include every aspect that you see before you. There is true howling. There is wailing in the book of Lamentations. There is ruing one's own deeds. There is bewailing. There is regret. There is grieving and mourning. All of these things happen to come up in the book of Lamentations, and for a reason. They're coming up because the book of Lamentations is effectively rather like the stages of grief that we all know. And the book of Lamentations includes all those stages. As such, it is a text of permission. It is a text that gives us the ability. Okay, Tony says he can't hear me. Is there anyone else who cannot hear me? John, you might want to communicate with Tony about his volume levels. It looks like everyone else can hear me. Please give me a thumbs up if you can hear me all right. All right, Tony, I'm going to ask you to chat with John so that you can communicate about what's going on there. So the text itself gives us that entire range. And I want to start by giving you a little background on the figure of daughter Zion. Do any of you know anything about daughter Zion? Does that name mean anything? Do you even know who she represents? Raise your hand if you do, if there's any kind of, oh, I know who daughter Zion is, response out here. Doesn't look like it. I'm not surprised, because even though the book of Lamentations is read every single year in a Jewish synagogue, and my experience is that my Christian friends don't read this text and generally don't encounter it, and may not encounter daughter Zion, who is a character who appears in two texts: prophetic texts like Ezekiel and Jeremiah, and this text of Lamentations. And in the texts of prophetic text, prophetic voices, she frequently represents not only Jerusalem, but even the people Israel. And she is accused by God of harlotry, which is the equivalent of, anyone know? In Jewish texts, in Hebrew Bible texts, harlotry is idolatry. When the ancient Israelites committed idolatry, it was read by the prophets as harlotry. So this was all put in the context of a marriage metaphor, right? God was in fact married to his people. His people, when they committed idolatry, were unfaithful to him. So you can see how this language develops. Now there's a whole long story. Maybe I'll come back some year and we'll talk just about the way in which the prophets effectively treat the language of marriage in ways that for us in our age would be difficult to accept, right? Because daughter Zion is accused in these texts of harlotry in some of the most violent language that you can find in Hebrew Bible. And just to give you an idea of how that looks, I'm going to share my screen once again and then give you an idea very briefly of how those kinds of texts look. And here are just a couple of them. In the prophetic texts, God and Zion are spouses. Zion, i.e. the people Israel, betrays God, and this justifies a violent retribution on the part of the deity, right? On the part of God. God has the right to respond with violence. And we can see some of these texts right here, particularly the Ezekiel text, right? I will inflict upon you the punishment of women who commit adultery and murder. I will direct bloody and impassioned fury against you. Again, there's a lot of work done on the way that these texts almost sound like domestic violence, like God is an abusive God, but that'll be another series for another time. The important thing for our text is that daughter Zion shows up in the book of Lamentations, and as a character, she turns everything on its head. She completely alters the way that she is seen. She is not the object that God is wreaking damage upon. She is not solely the subject, the object of this kind of violent retribution, but she becomes a subject. She begins to speak for herself. She does not do that in prophets. She does do that in Lamentations. And what is she doing? She is engaged in narrative acts of insubordination. Now, just to make this real for you, how many of you have ever permitted yourself to cry out to God in a way that said, what has happened is wrong? How many of you know what it is to have a moment of prayer where you say, what has happened here is wrong? This person I love who suddenly had a cancer diagnosis, this child that I know who is suddenly having her life threatened by mental illness, this human being, or this disaster, or the children washed up in the beach from refugee boats, or children in cages lying on a cement ground. I am sure that some of you have at some point or another bewailed a horror, a devastation, or a grief you yourselves know. Because I tell my students, I ask them, how old are you? They'll usually start with 18. And I'll say, by the age of 18, you already know what it is to grieve. Most 18-year-olds have had some experience with sorrow or grief, and many have had far too much of that. How much more so for those of us who have lived decades on this earth and seen decades of sorrow and grief. Is there any one of you who can openly say, I've done this and this is why? I have openly grieved and this is why I openly said to God, this is wrong. Is there anyone who has the, what we would say, the chutzpah to share that kind of experience that you might have had in your lives? I know this one's hard. It's hard to admit. Okay, Evelyn.
Every time I see mass shootings where people die, especially Sandy Hook, started it for me.
Maybe some of you remember that last year I was slated to discuss a particular text of Hebrew Bible, and I came in the Sunday after the mass shooting at UNCC, and I told you I couldn't do it. And instead I read you my lament. Do any of you remember that? I read you my lament for UNC Charlotte. Evelyn, I totally get that. I really do. So here we have in this text a total catastrophe. Jerusalem is completely destroyed. Everything is burned to the ground. The temple is destroyed. The priests and the prophets are slain in the temple. How does daughter Zion respond to that? There is a part of all of these texts that says, you Israelites, you have done something wrong. But in her voice, she actually does something interesting. She admits to rebelling in this text. But the word she uses, pesha, it might interest all of you to know that of the three main words in Hebrew that are translated often with the English word sin, not one of them really means sin the way we know it. Pesha is a rebellion. It's a political rebellion. Avon is a transgression, when you transgress against someone else. A chet is to miss the mark, to make a mistake. Can you hear how there's difference in the way these words are coming out in English than if I use the word sin for a rebellion, for a transgression, for making a mistake? Do you hear the difference? So what she admits to is a pesha. She has rebelled. And she says, yes, I've done that, but she never uses the word avon to refer to her own behavior. She never says I've transgressed. And she never applies the word uncleanliness, which the poet, the poetic voice does. She never applies that word to herself. And what is more, the Hebrew for uncleanliness here, the textual section here, is probably referring to what's happened to the sanctuary. Because remember, if you look at this text, the sanctuary has been breached. The priests have been murdered in the very sanctuary. So the uncleanliness that has occurred is that there has been murder of God's own servants in the sanctuary itself. A really important passage here that I would like to show you. So let me share my screen again. And we're going to move from those texts. They're here. Is this second one in 118? The first one is actually the use of the word pesha, where she says, the yoke of my offenses is bound last. My transgressions literally are actually in God's hand, is what she says here, right? And she admits the Lord has delivered me into the hands of her enemies. In Lamentations 1:18, it appears that she's admitting that God is right to destroy Jerusalem, to punish her like this. And instead, what we actually have, instead of this, for I have disobeyed him. This is so important, folks. The word here, mariti, also could mean embittered. Literally, these words that are translated for I have disobeyed him. This is his mouth, his words. You could translate this, the Lord is in the right, but I am embittered. I am made bitter by his command and his word. What's the difference between saying the Lord is right and saying I am embittered by what God has said, by what God has done, by what God has commanded? What's the difference for you? Any thoughts about that? Yes, Jane. Okay, hold on, Jane. I think you need, there you go. You're unmuted. Speak again, please.
In my Bible, it says, but I refuse to obey his commandments. So that's like a child angry and refusing to do what she's been told.
Right. So the translator, remember the traduttore, I traduttore, I gave this to you years ago. The translator is a traitor, right? The translator is, how many of you have ever translated a text from another language? Just raise your hand if you've ever done that in your lives. Okay, if you've done that, you know how hard that is. You know that translating another text so that it really conforms to the original is one of the most challenging tasks ever. You have to make decisions. Your translator, Jane, has made a decision not to translate the term mariti as I am embittered, although it is technically just as legitimate a translation as any other. To say I am embittered by God's word and by God's action is just as legitimate a translation as the one that's in your text, and possibly more. Why do I say more? Because if you continue on, if you have Lamentations in front of you and you go all the way down, then to another verse in which we see in 20, right? See the distress I'm in. My heart is in anguish. The phrase, I know how wrong I was, in my text has a little emendation that says Hebrew uncertain. Lamentations frequently has that emendation. Hebrew is uncertain because it's a poetic text and because it's hard to translate, and we don't necessarily have full command of poetic texts that were written thousands of years ago. That very verse includes this word, mariti, again. It comes up yet again in that text. And in essence, again, just right after the first use of that word, what could be getting said here is, in this sense here, not I know how wrong I am, but I experience bitterness. Can you see the difference between saying, I'm wrong, I deserved this, and I am embittered by what is happening? Can everybody see how fundamentally different that is? When my sister was dying of breast cancer at 42, after going through stem cell therapy and a radical mastectomy and chemotherapy and every other treatment that was available then, her cancer came back, and it came to her brain and to her lungs. And at 42, I will not forget the way she said, "What have I done to deserve this? What could I have done to deserve this?" So often we live in a world theologically where we blame ourselves first for the horror that has happened, especially in this day and age. We have to think. We must be asking, what did we do to deserve this? To deserve this isolation? to deserve this fear, to deserve this catastrophe, where people cannot even bury those they lose. We are experiencing Daughter Zion's world, a world of death and destruction and fear. And bitterness would be a perfectly legitimate response, wouldn't it? I asked my students last week, I said, a package arrived at your doorstep. It's completely safe to open. What does it contain? And after one said a cure, and another one said a vaccine, a third one said, my mother. Because she has not seen her mother for months now. Why do I emphasize Daughter Zion's bitterness? Why do I emphasize her resistance to the narrative that she is at fault? Given where we are today, what Daughter Zion says is, yes, okay, I have performed acts unworthy of you. I have made mistakes. I have rebelled. And she also says, you have no right to treat me this way. The response is more than I can endure. The punishment does not fit the crime. And so she emerges as a powerful voice protecting her children. She is the bereaved mother who says, what are you doing? You are destroying priest and prophet in the sanctuary. Your actions are leading to the starvation of my children. Now, I am guessing that none of you feel that God brought COVID-19 into the world. Right? And yet, we still had to endure, you and I, a Passover that celebrates liberation and freedom, while Jews were isolated and alone. Celebrates new hope and new birth, while my Christian friends were isolated and alone. How do we pray in this time? How do we lament? So now I'd like to ask you, what is the overpowering, dominant feeling you are having or struggling with right now in this time? What is the dominant feeling that you are struggling with? And I promise you, you'll find that in the text of Lamentations. So can you tell me, what is the dominant feeling you're struggling with or experience that you're struggling with? Yes, go ahead. It's Evelyn's husband.
The unknown of what's going to be tomorrow.
The unknown. Can we imagine that Daughter Zion looks at the tumult around her, and you'll find this very same voice will emerge in chapter 3, in chapter 4, and chapter 5. People saying, what's going to happen to us? It was our father's generation which experienced all this, and we are still suffering. What's happening to us and what's going to happen? And when will you help us to return to you? Among the last words of Lamentations are, help us to return to you. Help us to have hope again. Okay, the not knowing, what else has come up for you?
We also had the Yarborough said impatience.
Impatience, indeed. We will also find this in Lamentations, right? The impatient voice of, effectively, again, that second generation saying, why do we still have to suffer this way? That'll be chapter 4 and 5. You'll find some of those voices. Yes, Jane.
The isolation from family.
The isolation from family, absolutely. And I would even say the devastation of family. right? To be in a time where I know my best walking buddy, my 76-year-old walking buddy, who I have to keep up with at the age of 60, right? And how she spent her Easter absolutely alone, watching a service on her computer. I'm seeing also in the chat anger and bitterness towards the so-called leader in the White House. Indeed, I don't want to make God into, the president, but the kind of rage that daughter Zion feels against the ruler of her time, accusing that ruler of actually causing, exacerbating, making worse. Yes, Joanne too, anger at the lack of testing. I'm sure you all know that the first tests we were offered were within weeks of this outbreak showing up in China, produced by German teams, which we actually refused to accept because the World Health Organization offered them to us. So Donald Trump actually refused to accept those tests were being sent all across Europe when we had none. And they were effective ones. And instead we insisted on doing our own. And we all know what that happened as a result of that. I can totally get that anger. Anything else? And you can put things in chat here if you don't want to raise your hands.
From the YouTube audience, we have confusion.
Confusion. We are going to see in chapter 3 of Lamentations the most rampant amount of confusion when the Gever says, are you this? Are you that? I don't know who you are anymore. Are you my attacker? Are you my consoler? Are you my relief? And in the whole of 5 chapters of Lamentations, we never hear God's voice. God never answers any of those questions. Anyone else? Other things that have come up, feelings you've had? I can see Bob leaning forward. Bob, you got something you want to add to this?
No, I was just reading Leah.
Concern over the very vulnerable members of my family. How many of you have members of your family who are excessively vulnerable to this disease? Raise your hand. I have a student whose mother works at Walmart and has been working there the entire time. She is a refugee. I have another student who is taking care of an elderly grandmother. He is her only help and support.
We also have repeated cycles with moments of fear from YouTube.
Yes. I don't know about you, but when people ask me how I am not inclined to say I'm fine, I'm doing okay, I'm coping. I'm inclined to say it depends on the hour. Have I watched the news? Have I read another story? Have I heard from one of my seminary students that her daughter, who is in her 30s, just lost her best college friend to COVID-19, and the friend was in her 30s? It depends. In what way have you yourselves imagined expressing lament? I hear lament here, anger, bitterness, helplessness, confusion, not knowing. How and in what ways have you expressed your lament? I'm guessing no one has done that yet. Pidge.
I think Bob and I help each other by working through our feelings and our thoughts, which gives us a little bit of a balance. We each might have a different perspective on, yes, this is frustrating, but and I sense that folks that are alone don't have that opportunity, and it really is helpful.
Yes, that walking friend of mine has lost her husband 2 years ago. She lives alone. Right? I think having someone to be near is a way to mitigate this, right? Anyone else, how you are expressing your lament? And John, something from the YouTube audience?
Well, two more that for kind of the lament where we just were that are good. One was the inability to get everything done because of schooling children.
I want to give a big virtual hug to that parent, right? I have students who are parents of younger kids or teenagers trying to work this out with children at home, wondering what the effect is on their education. There have been some reports that have really pointed to this as one of the biggest problems we are going to face. What has been disrupted in terms of our children's education, their college education, their high school education, their elementary school education, and how have the parents dealt with the strain? And I don't know if you followed this, but what has happened, right? Domestic abuse is up and so is child abuse. Those places that are already vulnerable become more vulnerable. Those places that are already violent become more violent. Okay, other reactions or thoughts about how you have lamented, how you have expressed your lament?
Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. I guess I'm feeling incredible sadness for two grandsons that are graduating high school and wondering if they'll ever go to college.
This next generation, you know, my son was graduating a little bit after 2008, 2009. Remember that? Remember how lives really fell apart in that moment? He's now experienced twice in his life this kind of the world falls apart. And this time around comes with death, right? Last time came with disruption, an economic disruption that was horrible. This time I have colleagues who are trying to do the morning rituals that come through in Judaism on Zoom with people who cannot be at the funerals of those who have died, whether of COVID-19 or other reasons. And when we look at Lamentations, right? For these things do I weep. This is Lamentations 1:16. My eyes flow with tears. Far from me is any comforter who might revive my spirit. My children are forlorn. Can you hear what we've just heard? My children are forlorn. My grandchildren are lost or alone. Other ways that you've lamented, or human beings you've lamented for and with? Some thoughts, Bob?
I want to go back to something you just said. We live at the Pines in Davidson. We are really, as you know, locked down. We can't get out. We have had something like 12 to 13 deaths over the last month. Thankfully, none of them were from the coronavirus, but we have no way to attend any kind of service. We have no way of getting together here, which we normally do with family when those things happen. It just hurts. It's just a terrible thing that you lose friends and neighbors, but you can't really show that in any way. And so what you just said before about that, it's a terrible thing, and we're experiencing that.
Both in terms of joy and sorrow. The baby namings that can't take place in my tradition, or the weddings that have gotten canceled. The various kinds of celebrations of milestone birthdays. And then the death of people you've loved. I think there too, this text speaks to us to be hurled backward, to be left forlorn in misery. Those who have lost others are isolated in their sorrow, which is exactly the thing that both our traditions insist we do not do. We do not isolate those who are mourning, who are grieving in their sorrow. Thank you, Bob. Though I do think, again, find ways, bring people together on Zoom and tell stories of the person who was your friend. Share stories, right? When he did this, when he did that. Even over Zoom, you will have a chance to connect with each other. Yes.
Leah Chester Davis writes that she writes in her journal a lot, and that she and her husband rant and rave to each other on a regular basis.
I am so glad that Leah used the words rant and rave. There is a part of Lamentations in which daughter Zion actually puts God on trial. Have any of you ever heard of God being put on trial for any reason? Bob, you have? Why?
Our Bible study class is studying Job right now. Now, it hasn't achieved the trial, but Job wants to do it.
Yeah. Any other knowledge of God being put on trial? Yes, go ahead.
I recall 1 or 2 years ago that your class described a text that challenged God. And I guess I would say that's a trial. If I could remember what the text was, I'd be dangerous. I'm not.
There are plenty of texts in the Hebrew Bible that challenge God, surprisingly enough. One that I think most people that I know. Ben, are you raising your hand? I can't quite tell because you're frozen there. Let's just make sure that Ben isn't. Okay, we're going to find out later. Am I hearing you, Ben?
No, that was me. I think he's frozen.
Okay.
No, I didn't.
So a famous scene in which God is put on trial is in a book by Elie Wiesel. And he describes, I believe it's actually in Night, where he describes the execution of a young boy who is so thin, so emaciated, that even after they try to hang him, it takes him a long time to die because the weight of his body does not allow him to die quickly. And he describes people in Auschwitz putting God on trial, right? That actually is something that, as Bob points out, does Job want to put God on trial? Well, daughter Zion does. I can actually show you a text in which she does that, because I think this issue of ranting and raging is also an important one to acknowledge. So I'm going to show you where she does that. Right in here. There are some interesting word plays going on here. This word here, tipuchim, is the word for children. It sounds a lot like this word here, which is made of 2 of the 3 same letters. This one comes from the word tapach. This word comes from the root tavach. Did anybody hear the difference? Very, very soft. One is a P. The other one is a soft B that's almost like a V. Tapach, tavach. So the word for children is actually being rhymed in this text and punned on. Wordplay is going on here with the word that means butcher, right? So priest and prophet are slain in the sanctuary of the Lord, and children, right? Also here, the children are slain. And here, you slew. She's actually effectively putting God on trial. And then the culmination, these are the last 3 verses of the 2nd chapter of Lamentations. The culmination of that is an accusation of incredible power. You, God, she's speaking to God, you summoned us as if you were at a celebration. You brought my neighbors in from round about. On the day of your wrath, nobody survived or escaped. Those who I bore, right? Those, the children that I gave birth to, and that's where this word again should have been highlighted in Hebrew too, because that word is the same as this one up here, right? The children she bore, my foe has consumed. In the Hebrew, it is pretty explicit and clear that when she says my foe, she's speaking of God. She's not speaking of a group of enemies. She puts God on trial and says, you did this, right? Effectively, that text is a place where our ancient text says it is permissible for us to rant and to rave even at God. What's your reaction to that idea? That we have a text that gives you permission to rant and rave. I ask you this because I know the focus is, yes, wait, Evelyn, did I see your hand?
Yes.
Go.
I think it's important that God is giving us permission to get all of our feelings out, that we're not to harbor anything, even if it's at God that we're so angry.
Thank you. Anyone else want to add to what Evelyn just said? The permission to get your feelings out. How are you going to offer God your innermost prayer if you also hide from God your innermost feelings? Is not the process of prayer to be transparent before God? Also, after my sister died, I wrote quite a bit about her when I was working as a columnist for the Charlotte Observer. And one day, a woman called me up. She was in her 60s and her 40-year-old daughter had just died of breast cancer. And she said, every time she went to church and she talked about what happened, people told her, you're angry at God, you need to get over it. I can see Evelyn's face, right?
Yeah, it's all right to be mad at God.
Yes, indeed it is. Because God has an incredible bandwidth. God has a really wide bandwidth and can take that ranting and that raving and that rage and that frustration and the uncertainty and the questions.
Hey, Barbara, somebody
Yes.
from YouTube asked, so we rant to God, but then we feel guilty from ranting. But it really doesn't seem to benefit anyone. What do we do with that?
Ah, okay. That's an interesting thing, feeling guilty for ranting. Why? Why are you feeling guilty for ranting? I want to hear from that person. Let's get an answer. And we'll wait. And if any of the rest of you have an answer, why do you feel guilty for ranting?
Anybody?
Evelyn, you want to speak?
I think that we feel guilty because we think God has it all together and that we don't have a right to question what he's doing.
We think God has a plan. How dare we question?
Yes.
Uh-huh. Anyone else? Any other thoughts why we feel guilty?
Maybe because
I didn't quite hear that. Can we say that again?
Oh, hold on. Say that again, please.
Say again, please.
Perhaps because you grew up Lutheran, guilt was big there.
Possibly. Do we also have an answer from the person who posed the question, John?
Because it doesn't seem like it's a solution, and we don't really have a right to rant.
Ah, there, my friends, I must say that your tradition is somewhat different than mine. In the Hebrew Bible, we are given the right to rant, and there is no obligation to feel guilty about ranting. In fact, one of our most famous rabbis, Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, advised that we go regularly into the woods, into a green place where we could be entirely isolated, and we engage in the practice of hitbodedut, which means to just pour out everything that comes to us for 20 minutes without pause, right? Like just to get it all out, to explain how we feel. That is a world that I almost want to gift to you. The trust that God has the bandwidth to take your grief and your mourning and your ranting and your raving, to trust that this God will feel compassion, will extend that compassion to you. I had a friend who told me that when she was dealing with the sexual abuse of her childhood, she once spent much time screaming at God. She screamed at God and said, "You are nothing more than a peeping Tom. You watched all this happen to me when I was a child and you did not stop it." And she told me later, she was so clearly capable of feeling the compassion and the love and the sorrow of God for what she had endured, that getting that out was a transformative moment for her. Ranting and raving to God may be the way you access God's love and God's compassion on a level that is so deep you will never forget it. And that, I think, is the purpose of Lamentations, to access God's compassion and love on a level so deep that we never forget it. It is true that God doesn't answer us in these texts, but the plea that God answer us, the longing for God to answer us, is more acutely expressed in this text than in any other. And do we not all long right now to feel God's compassion and love and understanding? At this time, when we are frightened and uncertain and vulnerable, what could we want more? What could we need more? And that is a true question I am asking you. What could you want more or need more than the compassion and love and support that you have learned to rely on, but which you may not have felt ready to test? I think that Leah is quite correct. Years and years and years ago, I wrote an editorial for the Charlotte Observer about the weeping God. The God who must sorrow, I wrote then, because we have not cured the diseases that plague us. I wrote that then. The God who must sorrow that we have spent so much money on warring with each other rather than taking care of each other. Today, I would say the God that must sorrow to see that it is COVID-19 that must clear our skies and not the human beings that God created. A weeping God. Yes. And now, my friends, I want to ask you, if you were to write your own lament, the lament that begins with the word echa, alas. I'd like everybody to write down that word, alas. And then I would like you to consider starting your own lament. Alas, Lamentations begins, lonely sits the city, once great with people. If you are not getting a chill right now, lonely sits the city, once great with people. The squares are empty, right? As I wrote last year, I was using all of this language to describe UNCC empty of students and empty of staff and empty of teachers, because it had been cleared by a mass murderer. All you need to do is look on your screens and you will see empty cities and empty squares and empty playgrounds and empty parks. This is a text for your time. All you have to do is write your own vision using, in essence, its words. If you were to start with alas, is there anyone, and John, remind me when we need to close, so I'm mindful of time.
Another 5 minutes or so.
5 minutes. Is there anyone who can right now just take 30 seconds and imagine the first line of your lament? Alas. And then if you have a pencil, write out this first line, the first verse of your lament. And when you're ready, I'd love to see if anybody can share them in the chat. The first line of your lament, if you can share it in your chat or share it verbally. Pidge, you want to share it verbally? Okay.
Alas, people are fearful.
You just gave me a chill, like literally up my shoulders. Yes, people are fearful. Anyone else? Charles. Charles, we need to get your volume. There you go.
Alas, separation drains us and removes us from each other.
Alas, separation drains us and removes us from one another. Yes, beautiful. Alas, look at what's coming up in chat. How shall we go from here? Alas, no one is in control.
From YouTube, alas, isolated are your people.
Beautiful. So here is your homework for next week. If you haven't read the text of Lamentations, sit down with it and read it. And also begin to work on your lament. If you can, please send your lament to John. And John will post these anonymously if you prefer it to be posted anonymously. And I will be able to read them and you will be able to read them. So you'll see John's email in the chat. We want to hear your laments. I want to know how they go on. And I too will also write a lament, because I think teacher and students, we're all learning together. And we'll share them with each other. And I'd like to then end with a prayer. Holy One of blessing, you have brought us here in a wholly new way. And yet we are present and you are present. And we are grateful for the presence of each other and you. May we give to you all we know we can. Everything that we carry, every burden that is upon us, every fear and anguish we feel. And may you remind us that we are well and truly loved, that you hold us in your hand. And may we say amen.
Amen.
I will see you all next week with great joy. Do take good care of yourselves and be well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Barbara.
Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara.